Standardizing education used to mean building one rigid system and demanding that diverse students compress themselves to fit inside it. This is integration, defining India's 1974 scheme. Disabled students entered standard classrooms, but the static environment forced the student to adapt. Inclusion, codified in 2020, requires the inverse. The environment re-engineers itself. Ramps deploy, desks adapt, and specialized support is structurally integrated. India reached this standard through 54 years of sustained legislative engineering. We are going to trace the architecture of India's inclusive education policy, looking at how a basic mandate for access evolved, layer by layer, into a complex and enforceable legal framework. Securing equal education for millions of children requires specific legal scaffolding, precise resource allocation, and complete reconstruction of professional norms. This is Daulat Singh Kothari. In 1964, the Government of India appointed him to chair a comprehensive review of the entire education sector, setting the base layer for all subsequent policy. The Kothari Commission's 1966 report recommended a total structural overhaul, establishing the uniform 10+2+3 educational pattern that standardized schooling across the nation for the first time. To operationalize those recommendations, the government rolled out the first national policy on education in 1968. Its primary objective was fulfilling the constitutional mandate of providing free and compulsory education for all children up to the age of 14. The 1968 policy addressed the equalization of opportunity. It pushed for a common school system designed to bridge the educational gaps between rural and urban populations and male and female demographics. While this established a critical baseline for general access, it treated the student body as a uniform group. It lacked specific structural mechanisms, physical accommodations, or specialized guidelines for students with disabilities. The first targeted addition to the policy stack arrived in 1974 with the centrally sponsored Integrated Education for Disabled Children Scheme, or IEDC. The mechanics of the IEDC were purely economic. The scheme provided financial allowances for books, transport, uniforms, and escorts to help retain children in common schools. This highlights the operational flaw of early integration models. By subsidizing students to navigate a general community, the policy required no structural adaptation from schools. The timeline advances to the National Policy on Education, adopted by Parliament in 1986. This framework introduced a child-centered approach aimed at universal enrollment and retention. The 1986 NPE explicitly listed the education of the handicapped and weaker sections of society as a priority, framing their development as a requirement for national progress. Despite emphasizing equal opportunities, the system lacked the statutory power to force institutional adaptation or deploy specialized professional support inside the classroom. 6 years later, the Program of Action introduced a major diagnostic update. This 1992 modification to the NPE signaled a pivot from aspirational recommendations to binding commitments. This chart details the shift. The 1986 policy aimed for access, but the 1992 modification categorized elementary education as a fundamental right, staging enforceable legislation. It also mandated rigorous teacher training for diverse classrooms and prioritized science and technology for national growth. The 1992 update expanded the education pipeline. By explicitly encouraging open and distance learning, the policy widened the access path to higher education for populations unable to attend traditional campuses. To guarantee delivery, the government expanded the Operational Blackboard program. This mandated that schools physically possess a baseline of resources, including a minimum number of classrooms, teachers, and learning materials. With the 1992 modifications, India moved beyond the construction of school buildings to the legal enforcement of elementary education as a universal right. Establishing rights creates a new bottleneck: implementation. Integrating diverse students requires a highly specialized workforce, occupational therapists, clinical psychologists, and special educators, which the general school system lacked. To solve this, Parliament enacted the Rehabilitation Council of India Act in 1992. This added a rigid layer of professional regulation to the inclusive education stack. The RCI Act established the Central Rehabilitation Register. It standardized training policies, verified institutional credentials, and legally regulated the qualifications of every special educator operating across the country. Yet, a vulnerability remained. Even with standardized special educators, general inclusive policies often failed a specific demographic, students requiring high support for complex, severe disabilities. In 1999, the government passed the National Trust Act. This legislation built targeted scaffolding and legal guardianship specifically for these vulnerable populations. The National Trust Act covers 4 conditions: autism, cerebral palsy, mental retardation, and multiple disabilities. It created the DISHA scheme, funding dedicated daycare centers for early intervention and school readiness training for children up to 10. Simultaneously, the SMART scheme funds respite homes. This provides acceptable living standards, basic medical care, and critical relief time for families managing intense caretaking responsibilities. By the late 1990s, the policy stack had matured. The objective expanded from putting children in a room to deploying a regulated workforce and installing precision safety nets for severe cases. The system's legal authority sharpened with the Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995, which established education as an individual right rather than a policy recommendation. The 1995 Act legally guaranteed the right to free education up to age 18 in appropriate environments. It also mandated a 3% reservation in government employment for persons with specific disabilities. While the 1995 Act was a milestone, its boundaries eventually proved too limited for the realities of diverse learning needs, forcing the 2016 RPWD Act. The 2016 RPWD Act adopted a dynamic concept of disability. It expanded legal recognition from 7 conditions to 21, adding specific learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and chronic neurological conditions to the mandate. The Act forced structural compliance. It mandated strict timeframes for removing architectural barriers, enforcing the design of accessible public buildings and transport compartments. Educationally, Section 16 of the Act commanded institutions to provide reasonable accommodations tailored to individual requirements, detect specific learning disabilities early, and supply transportation for students and their attendants. The 2016 legislation signaled a final shift. It placed the legal burden of physical and pedagogical adaptation entirely onto the state and the educational institutions. 5 decades of legislative updates, commissions, and legal mandates culminate in the National Education Policy of 2020. NEP 2020 takes the legal mandates of the 2016 RPWD Act and operationalizes them into daily classroom logistics. The policy achieves this through the Inclusive School Complex. This model consolidates resources, ending the isolation of rural schools by networking them together. The policy mandates physical resource centers built directly inside these complexes. Schools must recruit special educators with cross-disability training to ensure on-site support for individualized accommodations. Evaluation is also overhauled. The policy introduces PWD, a national assessment center responsible for formulating flexible assessment guidelines that adapt to the student's pacing from foundational to higher education. For students with profound disabilities, the policy supports homeschooling. Resource centers and special educators are required to provide technological solutions and orientation directly to parents. NEP 2020 functions as the final operational blueprint. It forces abstract rights, professional registers, and architectural mandates into the functional machinery of local schools. Tracing the lineage from the 1966 Kothari baseline to the 2020 National Education Policy reveals the mechanics of systemic change. The state moved from the 1974 IEDC model, providing a uniform allowance in an unmodified room, to demanding total architectural and pedagogical overhauls. That transition relied on regulatory scaffolding. Bodies like the Rehabilitation Council of India and frameworks like the National Trust Act generated the trained professionals and safety nets required to execute the laws. India's policy evolution over the decades proves that simply unlocking the front school doors does not guarantee an education. Educational equity is only achieved when the system is legally compelled to study the student, reconstruct its architecture, and adapt. That is the exact difference between sitting in a classroom and actually being included in it.